It's Friday, and you know what that means. We are all gearing up for another weekend of exciting Legends of Runeterra tournament action. The main one is going to be the Online League Series, which I'll have the info for in the description below. And if you're just looking for something to watch, you could also check out the Team Leviathan Gaming Invitational that's going to be going on this Saturday, and I believe into Sunday as well. That one's going to be I think it's like 16 or maybe even 32 invited players playing in a single deck, side deck format. So if that's your jam, you can go ahead and check that out. Or you can participate or watch the Online League Series that's going to be running in the normal 3-deck Riot format. So take your pick, but let's get into how did the Pack Your Bags nerf affect the tier list. So the tier list looks a little bit less cluttered now, you may have noticed. I put a decent amount of work into it over the course of the week, and I think this is how I'm going to run it from now on, where I have each of these links to a deck on my Mobalytics page so that I can go in and consistently edit that deck list at any given time, so I don't have to go and find another tournament topping list. So some of these are directly copied from people that won or topped tournaments. A couple of these are just off the top of my head. I've seen the deck enough times, I have a general idea, and there's a little notes section on a couple of them in case, I want to cover a couple of card choices that you could run. I think on Lee Sin specifically, I go over some of the options. Yeah, there's a nice little write-up. I don't know why Mobalytics does this thing recently where I have to refresh it. But yeah, there's a little write-up here telling you about, some of the other card choices that you could go for, some of the numbers that fluctuate and things like that. So you may have noticed a couple of updates to the tier list. This is how I probably want to run this operation from here on out. Basically, all of these sample deck lists are going to link back to my Mobalytics page, where I've created a list that either I directly copied from someone who topped or won a tournament, or I just kind of made off the top of my head because I've seen the deck enough times. And the reason that I wanted all of them to be centralized on my Mobalytics is so that at any point I can go in and edit that deck if there's an update to it that happened over the course of a week that you missed, and it's like a Tuesday night, and I'm like, oh yeah, I've seen this new Draven Swain list. They're no longer running Tribeam Improbulator. Let me go edit that. I don't have to find a specific tournament topping list. And then I believe this is probably a good example. So for whatever reason, you have to refresh Mobalytics these days in order to actually get the list. But I have a little write-up on a lot of the decks about the card choices that you can run. Some of these are sample lists, but I really did want you to be able to just copy and paste this and enter a tournament with it. So I did do a little write-up for a couple of them, not telling you how to play the deck, but telling you about some of the other card choices that players have made that you can make, and what kind of level of a personalization this deck can go for, or if it's a very rigid build, kind of stuff like that. And then I want to get into, obviously, the tier list. So Pack Your Bags was nerfed to 5 mana, and that was the only balance patch that we got in, or the only balance change we got in patch 2.0. The latter data suggests that almost nothing has happened to TF Gohard. The deck is still being played as much as it was, the deck is still winning as much as it was. I'm a little bit pessimistic about it in tournament, specifically because of the big three, or whatever tier 1 decks, it seemed like the most exploitable, and there's this weird inverse operation where, because Gohard got nerfed, now you should see less Gohard, which means you should see less of the lineups that we're looking to pick on Gohard, which should make Gohard better. It's kind of a slippery slope. I'm gonna wait until the weekend to kind of see how it all actually plays out, and then you can check back on Monday for Tournament War Room, where I'll tell you how things actually all shook out. So I did bump it down to tier 2, and honestly, I got tired of just discussing with other players what archetype TF Gohard filled into, so you have an opinion on it. I think that everybody who has played in a tournament or plans on playing in a tournament knows what TF Gohard looks like and does, and if not, of course, there is this sample deck list here with a small write-up about Atrocity and Wiggly Burblefish and things of that nature. So let's go over what is in tier number 1. So Targon Grand Plaza has been popping up a lot more, especially in the Brazilian scene. Brazil really likes to run the Invoke version with Mountain Scryer. That one's typically going to be Zoe Aurelian Soul, but they've also been going with this more Leona Aurelian Soul. Garen A Soul is totally missing in action. Haven't seen that deck for a hot minute. And I think that Leona Asol is usually going to come up when you want to run another Zoe deck somewhere in your lineup. I do think that the Zoe version of the deck is just better, but the Leona version does look different enough that, and that's what's cool about this, is I get to separate out the deck lists and I can clearly label which one is which. So that's awesome. Obviously, Zoe Lee Sin still going to be in tier 1. Shen Fiora is still here. Draven Swain has come up pretty big over the last couple of weeks, and I think really overtaken Draven Ezreal. I think in Fight Night tonight, Draven Ezreal is still running rampant. There are a lot of players who haven't jumped onto the Draven Swain bandwagon. Personally, I like the deck a lot more. I think that it's a really cool list. It adds a lot more late game value to the deck, and I wasn't the biggest fan of the Draven Ezreal. There were a lot of games where the deck either functioned or it didn't, and I think that Swain has less games where the deck just inherently doesn't function. But you can take a look at that list versus the Ezreal list, and I even labeled them as different archetypes. I think that Draven Swain is a little bit more mid-range and the Draven Ezreal is a little bit more aggro, because generally when you say that Draven Ezreal has a good matchup against a deck, it's because they don't handle the early wide board of House Spider into Draven, into a Chump Wump, into like another House Spider and a Sump Dredger or Ballistic Bot, something like that. Whereas Draven Swain, the Swain Leviathan combo in itself can fix some matchups, and just having 4 8 drops in the triple Leviathan Farron as opposed to the double Farron that you typically see in Draven Ezreal, I just feel like the Draven Swain is covering its bases a lot better. Obviously, there are some weaknesses that it has that Ezreal doesn't, but you can go ahead and check out the small write-up on the deck for a little bit more info on that. And then rounding it out, we have Invoke. I've been talking about this deck for a long time. I love this deck. It's my go-to on ladder, and I think that it is probably my favorite Zoe deck, but really Tier 1 is just about picking which Zoe deck you want to run in the tournament that weekend. Then in Tier 2, we've got, sort of our normal players, Mist Wraiths, Scouts. I put Go Hard down here, just sort of cover my bases. I definitely don't think it's dead, but I think its tournament playability is going to suffer, and that's what I mentioned earlier with the slippery slope. So I think Tier 2 is where I'm willing to put it for now. I very well could be wrong. I don't think it's going to be worse than Tier 2, but I could see arguments for it to be Tier 1, but I think that we're probably not even going to get a very wide sample of it this weekend. I think that players are really just looking for an excuse to run anything else, so it'll be hard to gather data on week 1. So check back, week 2, week 3, maybe I'll have a little bit better of an idea of where Go Hard actually should be placed. A lot of these decks have been on the tier list for a while. They should be self-explanatory. Field of Rush, Frostbite Midrange, Star Spring, Scouts, Wraiths, Discard Aggro, moved up from Tier 3. Discard Aggro is one of the best decks on ladder right now. I think it boasts one of the highest win rates, but a pretty low play rate. Aggro in tournaments has always been a little bit different. I've covered this before, where it feels like unless you're running a 3 aggro lineup, that aggro deck needs to be high tier 1 to find its way into other lineups. And I think making a triple aggro lineup is not only more difficult than it's been in the past, but less likely to work out. And because Go Hard is still going to see some amount of play, that's what was keeping things like Discard Aggro down, and I don't think that you're necessarily going to find yourself in a advantageous position if you decide to run this into a tournament. If you look at the archetypes, it actually does just look like Tier 1 is the mid-range tier, and then Tier 2 is like the aggro tier. But let's talk about Teemo Sejuani, because if you haven't been paying a close attention to the tournament scene, this one might have slipped by your radar because its performance on ladder is incomparable to its performance in tournament. Now, this is a very solid tournament deck, and I feel like every time we run into a tournament deck, it's typically Freljord, Zombie Ash, I'm looking at you. But what this deck does is it offers a little bit of versatility in the build line. You can either go for the Hex Core Foundry or the no Hex Core Foundry with Field of Rush. There's a lot of flexibility and personalization in the way that the deck can be played right now, but I think a lot of that stems from an unsolved list rather than actual personalization within the list. I know that Starlit Seer is probably one of the more argued about cards at the moment, and apparently Foundry is as well, but I think overwhelmingly, I'd say it's like 80% Foundry, 20% non-Foundry. But the deck has really good matchups against some of the key decks in the format, namely Zoe Lee Sin combo, because so many Frostbites just make it difficult for the Lee Sin. Sometimes you don't even have to commit a Frostbite effect. You just get that, ideal Sejuani Teemo combo going, or even just Ballistic Bot or, a Mystic Shot at the face will even stop the Lee Sin. And it's kind of weird. I'm trying to figure out where Nopify falls in the format as well, with TF Go Hard specifically falling down to the wayside. Nopify was primarily a let's stop the Go Hard sort of strategy. Now it doesn't. If you look at like the tier 1 decks, Nopify doesn't get a lot of value, and being able to stop the Mystic Shots out of Teemo Sejuani is something that would help Zoe Lee Sin a lot. So if you're looking to run Zoe Lee Sin and you're worried about Teemo Sejuani, maybe keep those Nopifies in there. As far as Teemo Sejuani goes, yeah, just load up on the 5 Frostbites, play your game plan. These backline units works really well against a lot of the meta, and yeah, I think that it's a really cool deck, and I would absolutely say you should try it out in a tournament this weekend if it's something that you're interested in. And honestly, I don't want to touch on Tier 3 too much. Field of Mina, Lucian Plaza, Zoe Karma. Zoe Karma is a pretty new deck. I just wanted to put it on the tier list to get some more eyes on it. It's a really cool control deck, sort of like Heimerdinger Zoe or Heimerdinger Vi was for a while, except it doesn't really have those auto win hands. But if you're looking for a challenge, definitely try picking up Zoe Karma. Don't recommend it on ladder, but let's talk about what a typical lineup going into this weekend would look like for a 3-deck Riot format. A standard lineup going into something like this weekend really could be anything. As I had mentioned, we're kind of in a power deck format where you don't worry too much about countering your opponent's lineup. You just pick what you think are the 3 strongest decks. And there's a lot of really safe picks in the format. I think that Zoe Lee Sin, Shen Fiora, Draven Swain, or Draven Ezreal probably going to be a pretty safe lineup to go with. Personally, if I were running it, I like replacing the Zoe Lee Sin with Invoke. You only get to run one Zoe deck, and I think that Zoe does add a lot to both of these decks, too much to really make a consideration on one versus the other, and potentially maybe even go for a Targon Grand Plaza instead of the Shen Fiora. But I think that I'd rather keep on the Shen Fiora. It feels a little bit safer, but I think that Invoke is just a little bit less exploitable than the Zoe Lee Sin. And yeah, I think that's what, like, a standard lineup. It's a pretty good place to start. I definitely think you're going to get some kind of Zoe deck in just about every lineup. Really not much counterplay to a card like that. Its utility is amazing. It's why we see so much Zoe in the format. And then if you want to actually try and take advantage of the lack of Go Hard, if you think that a lot of people aren't going to be running that this weekend, I think this is what an aggro lineup would look like for the weekend. Probably Scouts, Mist Rates, and Discard aggro. It's a little hard to tell, and it's been a while since we've seen an honest-to-goodness aggro lineup do, pretty well in a tournament. For the most part, it's been quite some time since players were able to find 3 real aggro decks and run that out, other than running like 3 fearsome decks in the seasonal tournament. But yeah, I think that's what your normal lineups are going to look like. And of course, you can slot other decks into that don't fit the requirements, like Teemo Sejuani maybe replaces my Fiora Shen. And that is going to do it for this week's Tournament Tactician. As I'd mentioned, the online league series is going to be running this weekend. Check the description below for the information on how to sign up for that, as well as a link to the tournament tier list, as well as all my other socials. And I'll be back with another Tournament War Room on Monday to let you know how everything shook out this weekend. If we got to see any aggro lineups, or if it's just wishful thinking on my part to see a little bit more diversity in the way that players are building out their lineups in this meta. So until then, my name is Boulevard, and as always, good luck in your tournaments.